Hello, everyone. It's me, Andrew. I'm here in my home in lovely Ligonier, Pennsylvania. You may be looking at your watch and you're like, what? It's not 5 o'clock. What are you doing? You're not supposed to be on. Well, if you saw my personal timeline, or if you follow my Instagram feed, or if you watched the the live last night, then you may have seen that I'm working on a new series. And I'll pause right there, and I'll give you a little bit of the backstory of that. All right. So last week I was super fortunate to take a workshop with the wonderful Ms. Elizabeth Brim from Spruce Pines, North Carolina. I don't know if she's actually from Spruce Pines or if it's Penland. Anyways, she's in that area. And yeah, so I was super fortunate to take a workshop at the Center for Metal Arts in Johnstown. It was a really wonderful experience. A lot of the stuff I made isn't like, it doesn't look maybe amazing. Um, but what she did is she went through and showed us a lot of the basics and really get into the mindset of like the nitty gritty of how things are made and what happens if you do certain things. And so a lot of the pieces I made, there were things like the hooks and stuff. I kept them because I can see where I kind of messed up, and it's a good reminder. I think it's important to keep things, a few things to remind you of your progress. So I had a really wonderful time working with her, and I had a couple breakthrough aha moments, and it was really wonderful. I don't know about y'all, but it's it's almost I don't want to say divine, but it's like the muses start singing and stuff in your head, and things started unlocking in my brain, and I was like, I understand how to do this. So it was really nice. And yeah, uh anyways, so I finished up that workshop, and I was like, one of the things one of the reasons why I haven't made any really significant progress with blacksmithing is that I just don't do it enough. So whenever I get an opportunity to take a class, I'll do it at Touchstone or Center for Metal Arts. There's a couple local places that I'll pop into, but the classes are sometimes a couple months apart, sometimes longer, and I don't really get a chance to do it very much. So I thought it would be good to, for one, take some more classes and keep that momentum up and keep that education flowing. I feel like it's a really important step for my evolution as a jewelry maker and an artist. I feel like it's one of those things where I'm deepening my relationship with metal and understanding it a little bit better. And I think that that's really important for me. Um, I've talked about this before where I'm a little bit, I don't want to say I'm a slow learner, but I am one of those people who is more, it doesn't always come quick to me. So there are people like William who, when he takes a class, he just like sits down and they show him and he does it, and bam, he's like, looks like the teacher made it. For me, when I sit down, I'm like, and it takes a while to kind of percolate into there. But once it does, it kind of takes root, and it becomes something that I internalize and make it my own, and it kind of filters through. And maybe it takes a little while to filter through because I'm so stubborn. But yeah. So, anyways, I've determined that I want to take some more blacksmithing classes over the summer. And throughout, I would like to, for as long as I can. And so there's a wonderful opportunity coming up. And right now we're kind of stretched thin. We've got so many irons in the fire, as they say. And we really can't afford to do that. For this workshop, for the Elizabeth Brim workshop, I was super fortunate, and I got a grant, an educational grant from the Society of Inclusive Blacksmiths, and that helped dramatically to offset the expenses. So that really helped and allowed me to do that and make it more doable. Um, it's tricky because there are things that you don't really necessarily take into account. Like when I'm in a class, I'm not necessarily working all day. So that kind of, we have to acknowledge that and take a hit because I can't necessarily work while I'm also taking classes. I mean, I try to keep up, but at the same time, it's not the same level of, precision. So, or kind of that kind of dedicated focus. So yeah, so there's a lot of things that it gets kind of expensive to take workshops, as some of you know. Even with help, it adds up. So I wanted to take more classes. There's a wonderful class coming up in May, and there are 2 spots open. And I hope I'm not advertising for those spots to get taken. Maybe 1 spot can get taken, but I will really want that 1 spot. So I'm trying to make a series of work to help offset the expenses of that, and also hopefully to raise enough to buy some equipment for Star Cottage Studio so that I can continue to make, blacksmith, and make tools for my jewelry making. That's kind of at current, that's the end goal. Like I want to be proficient in making my own tools, and I see the possibilities with that. I'm sure you all are well aware that jewelry tools can kind of get pricey, and when you can make your own, then it really opens up a lot of opportunities. Not only is it more affordable, but you can also customize them and make exactly what you want and what you need. Um, and some of the things that I'm interested in um, are Japanese processes, and some of those tools are not necessarily readily available here in the US. Um, so it's hard to get certain like chisels and things like that when you could just make them yourself and save the plane ticket. Although I would love to go, it's just hard when you have a house and pets and things. So, anyways, so I'm working on this series to hopefully pay for this new class and to get some new tools. And whenever I kind of set a goal for myself like this, I always like to do a project that helps fund or offset that project. Um, the business, I feel I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I feel like I feel guilty when I burden uh William and the business with all of these extra expenses. When all the money that we make pretty much goes back into the store and building it up and kind of keeping it going, especially in the hard times, and paying for taxes and different things like that. So it's always like a cycle, and I feel like if I add stuff to that cycle, it's kind of selfish of me. So one of the things that I like to do is I like to make a series of work and sell that and have that help fund those things. And I've been doing it ever since I've been little, when we were growing up, we didn't have very much money. So that was the only option. If I wanted something, I had to figure out a way to do it. And I didn't always, you can't necessarily get a full-time job when you're in fifth grade, you know. So I would make little sculptures out of polymer clay and paint rocks and do different things like that. And I would sell them. My grandma and grandpa used to have yard sales, and I would have my little station, and I would sell those. Most kids were selling lemonade, but I was selling my little artwork and crafts. And my mom and dad, we lived on this busy road, and they used to have this thing where they would have fancy handmade quilts, was my mom's business, and they would kind of take a clothesline and line up all the quilts. And we one of my jobs was to watch it and run inside and get my mom whenever somebody drove up. And this is before like the internet and before a lot of things where you could just like go to the store and buy a handmade quilt. So I would also have my little section of things that I would try to sell and make extra money. And my grandparents were children of the Great Depression. So anything that we could do to make money, that was, legal, they were highly supportive of. And I think like if my grandma was alive now, and um, she'd be like an Etsy superstar, because she was always crafting things and always making things and always had kind of this side hustle going. And yeah, so I think that kind of trickled down into my brain, and I've always had that kind of philosophy of um, trying to do that whenever I try to launch into a new project. Um, so that's what started this. And also, when I was in college, I had the luck to work with an artist named Peter Hirschstoff, and he is an amazing artist. He's really a very kind and compassionate teacher, very encouraging. And I had him for a drawing seminar. And one of the projects that we did was this 24-hour marathon. And so you had to make 100 paintings in 24 hours. And it was a big project. And we'd go to the studios, and everybody would be kind of locked in, and it was very festive. And you'd start painting, and you'd get a little bit slap happy and delirious. But the idea was that you only have this amount of time, and so you have to make something. It kind of distills your visual vocabulary. What colors are you interested? What processes are you interested? What imagery are you interested? And when you do this, it's a very easy to see that that idea. And then at the end, you have 100 pieces of artwork, which is pretty cool. And so when I was in school, we would sometimes trade. And that was a good way to kind of build up our little budding collections as young art students. Um, and it also, I think, fostered a sense of community. So I do this periodically every couple of years. It seems like more now. And I do these 100 series, um, for one, to kind of get in touch with my artistic practice, but also it's a little bit distracting. And you can hear the sirens in the background. Williams probably told you about this, but our volunteer fire department is very active in the area. And so they'll set off a siren, and then the responders go out and help, which, thankfully we haven't had to use their services, but we're very lucky to have them. But anyway, so yeah, so I think it's really wonderful when you can kind of dial into your what you're interested in, and that imagery appears, and those colors and those stories. And it's also a nice way for me, like I said, to help fund my educational pursuits. So this is the first check-in of this new 100 series. And I thought I would show you kind of the early process. Now, I will say, okay, so originally Peter had us to do this all in 24 hours, and I used to do that for years and years and years. However, the last couple times I've tried to do it, I've just crashed and burned, pretty much. And it's kind of weird because I sometimes will stay up late for extended periods of time, but for whatever reason, it's just overload and it feels like I got hit by a truck. So I've kind of been spacing it out. And I started on Saturday night, and started cutting up the pieces, which takes a surprisingly a long time. And then I started adding different layers. And I thought it would be nice to show you, if you haven't seen this. I have a sped up video on my Instagram stories, but those are they're only active for about 24 hours. So if you missed it, you kind of missed it. So I thought it would be nice to show you how I build up the first couple layers and then check in throughout the day, and show you what I'm working on. How does that sound? It's a little bit different, and I thought that I might share some photos, some inspiration photos, maybe, um, and talk about things like that. Uh, and that will hopefully give you a little bit of an insight into what I'm thinking when I'm making these. I'm going to try to keep these as affordable as possible. One of the other reasons why we do these kind of projects like this is because we are very cognitive that some of my bigger pieces are just simply not accessible for a lot of people. Um, they get to be several hundred or several $1,000s, and not everybody can afford that. And I think it's nice to be able to feel a part of a community. And if you want to support somebody, you have that option to do that. Um, and if you want a little bit of somebody's artwork, then you can actually get it. So this is also a nice way to kind of treat our loyal kind of followers and our support network, and say, hey, thank you for helping us get this opportunity. Thank you for helping with this educational opportunity. Thank you for this equipment. Thank you for bettering our lives. And this is like the small kind of like talisman or token of that appreciation. So that's kind of what I think of when we do things like that, like this. And yeah. All right. So I'm going to flip this around, and you're going to see. Um, I'm going to show you how I start these. All right. So you're going to see the ceiling for a second. William has all these fancy cameras, and then me, there's one option, back camera. All right. And then I'm working on glass right now so I don't mess up William's desk, because I'm in his office. So one of the things, this is from an earlier series that I did many, many moons ago, probably 20 or more years ago. And, I think it's one of those things where when you kind of have them, it's nice to have them, but sometimes they just take up room, and then you're like, what do I do with this? So obviously my skill level and my interests have changed and hopefully improved. So these are kind of the bases of Vivian says some people may not be able to afford the big ticket item, but some may. Please show those too. I think we show those pretty frequently um, throughout the year. Um, so I'm not going to focus too much on that because I think it's a diversion from what this project right now. But I'm happy to show those bigger ticket items after I'm finished. Um, and I know that kind of sounds weird. You'd think that I would be like trying to show everything. But it's one of those things like when I'm in it to win it. And I don't really want to deviate from the path because it gets kind of where you kind of lose focus. And one of the things about these kind of marathon sessions where you're working and especially working towards a specific goal, it's so important, so important to have those strategies. So one of the things that I realized early on when I was doing this is that for one, it got kind of expensive because one point I was doing these cradled panels, and those are super. I don't want to say they're super expensive, but they're not inexpensive, and 100 of them times even $5, that's already $500 that you'd be spending. So I decided to move towards working on paper, and so that's this is all Bristol board. Bristol board, and it's a hot press Bristol board. So what that means is they take these rollers and they heat them up, and it makes it have a smoother texture. The issue with hot press things is sometimes the paper can have a memory. And so with these, they take hot rollers that are great big and it curls the paper up. And because the rollers are, cylindrical. And when they do that, it flattens it out when it dries. But when it gets a little bit of moisture, it starts curling up and starts to remember that hot roller. So you'll see in a minute what I have to do to kind of combat that. So the first thing I did was I took these old pieces that I had from before and I cut them down, and I decided that a manageable size was 4x6. Um, and this size, 4x6, is a doable size. One thing that I realized before is I try to do great big pieces for these 100 series projects. And for one, it takes up an incredible amount of room. Even these take up a lot of room. If you work really small, because I thought, oh, one time I did this, I was like, oh, I'm going to do these little 2x2 squares. Um, and they actually took longer to do than the big pieces. With the big pieces, you can kind of get gestural and do be more expressive. When it's small like that, like it's a little tab like that, then you have to get out the brushes that are like the sizes of hairs, and that's also takes a long time and is very meticulous, and is it's good to do it, but to do it in a short amount of time is a Herculean effort. So I figure that this was kind of the in between of small and great big, and it's a cost affordable option, and it allows me to reuse some of my old artwork that's just kind of sitting around, and it gives it a new life. And these layers you're not going to actually see. So, I mean, you may get a hint of something every once in a while, but I kind of think of artwork as like people. And when you go and when you meet somebody, you don't always know all the things that they're thinking or their experiences. And in the process of getting to know somebody, those kind of layers become revealed. And so I like to have artwork sometimes where I'll have something and it will be underneath everything else. And it's a way for me to kind of build that history. And I talked with one professor once a while ago, and they were like, "Well, when do you know when to stop?" And I think it's one of those things where it's an intuitive process where eventually you come to learn when something is done. And that's something that I struggle with because I can noodle around. William may have mentioned this in some of the other lives, but we don't have a lot of my artwork hanging up. We have tons of artwork on our walls, hundreds and hundreds of paintings and things like that, but not a lot of my own artwork. And one of the reasons why is when I start looking at it, I start seeing little things that I want to change. And when it's my artwork, then I feel like I have that kind of artistic license to do whatever I want, because I'm in control. And yeah, so I don't hang a lot of my artwork because I have that compulsion to want to noodle around on something and fix it. So that's one of the reasons why I don't have a lot of my artwork on display in my own home. Anyways, so I have these and they make up the base layer. There's 100 of these. I also, a couple months ago, maybe, I did some, I did a tutorial on how to use the gel press to make papers, painted papers. And so I had a bunch of these kind of pieces of paper that had color on them and that I liked, but I really didn't have a plan for it beyond making those paper beads. So I had all these pieces and I was like, well, what am I going to do with these? Because I didn't want to throw them away because I felt like there's still something good about them, you know? And so what I did is I started to make these. And these are just, again, these are early layers. And in all likelihood, you will not be able to see these once they get covered over. But I started working on blocking things out like this. And using those pieces of paper. Now, one of the other reasons why I'm using this is to thicken up the surface that I'm working on. Because the Bristol board, like I was talking about earlier, about wanting to curl, this will help uh, um, diffuse that surface tension. So as it becomes thicker, it's less likely to curl. I'll never get it 100% perfectly flat, but that's okay. So one of the things that I do in addition to that is I put an X of gesso on the backs of these, and you can see where I had done this previously. Now those X's, what those do is as they dry, they contract. So if this is folding upwards, if you put the X of gesso on the back, it will pull it flatter, if that makes any sense. So that's why eventually, probably sometime tonight, while I'm working, I'm going to go in and re-X the backs of these because these are kind of like a weird shape now. It's kind of like this C shape or U shape. And you can see it's actually pulling the paper. I don't know if you can see that, but you can see it's pulling it. Um, and so it's just one of those material things that I like to think about. Like, how can I make the pieces, um, you know, behave how do I make the materials behave the way I want them to? All right. So the glue that I use is actually not a regular glue. And you're going to see this glue bottle in the videos. Don't get tricked. This is not the glue that I use for it. There may be some residue of this wood glue, but that's not the glue that I actually use. And the reason why I don't use that is because when it dries extremely hard. It almost becomes like a shell. And the other thing about that is that it becomes super brittle. So if I try to flex some of the pieces and they're not built up, like if I have a piece and it's bending and I want it to curve like this, if I did this and just use the regular wood glue on this, it would crack and you would actually hear it snap like a wafer. And I don't want that to happen. So what I use to make the glue that I use for my collage elements is I take this PVA glue. I like this glue because you can dilute it with water, and it's not something it's super toxic. So some of those things, one, either get really sticky and never dry. Number two, you have to clean up with a solvent, which is a pain in the behind. Number three, um, it becomes it becomes very hard to work with. So, like what some of those other glues, they become almost water resistant. So, what happens is when you try to paint on top of something using a water based paint, because if something is water resistant, it bleeds apart and it won't actually stick to the surface. So, I can't do that. I can't use those. So, I like PVA glue because, for one, it's archival, and that means it's a non-yellowing glue, which is super important to me because I want these things to be able to not turn. I mean, all things evolve, and I have to be okay with that. But I don't want it to necessarily turn kind of like a crusty yellow color, within days of me making it. If I want that effect, I can make that effect, but if I don't want that effect, I don't want to be surprised by that. The other thing about this glue is that it's not acid, it's pH neutral, so it's not super acidic. And why that's important is that when you're working with paper, if you get something that is not pH neutral, it may hold up for the temporary, but over time, that acid will eat away the paper and make it brittle and very fragile and fall apart. Um, there, there are some natural glues that I sometimes use. Like sometimes I'll use methyl cellulose. It gets super flat and very matte. There's an artist named Hannah Hulk, um, who is a very well established collage artist from art history. And she used methyl cellulose to do her pieces. However, the thing is that if you get any kind of moisture with that, um, it can start to curl and sometimes it can just fall off. So there's a lot of concentrate conservation work that has been done on her pieces to restore them. So I like PVA glue because it lasts, it's archival, the pieces are not gonna fall off. Now, the one thing that I do not like about PVA glue is that when it dries, it looks like vinyl because it is polyvinyl acetate. And so it looks plasticky. And I do not necessarily want my pieces to look like plastic. So the thing that I do to make it not look like plastic is I mix a small amount of matte medium in it. This is is not the super thick version because I don't want to necessarily have a paste, but I mix a little bit of this matte medium in with my PVA glue. And to thin it down, I use this water-based dead flat varnish, and that it's a wonderful product that a lot of people who are using this for not necessarily, I don't want to say they're not using it for art, but this is used mostly for like backgrounds and things like that. It dries fast, there's no odor, it doesn't yellow. It's water based, but it's water and abrasion resistant. Um, and it also doesn't leave a haze on dark surfaces. And that's super important. There are some products that I can use that are like a clear gesso. Clear gesso is a really wonderful product. However, if you put it on black or a dark color, it looks hazy and kind of scuzzy. And I don't necessarily want that. So I mix this instead of water into my PVA glue and matte medium mixture to help thin it out and also to add um, some of that matte quality to it. Because I also want my pieces to have a tooth to stick on. Not too much of a tooth, but I don't want it to be like super slick. And then you do all this painting and adding stuff to it, and then you just scrape it off or it just rubs off or whatever. I want these things to last if I'm sending them out into the world. But I put them in this container because it's super useful. I like that my fingers, I can use two fingers to apply things to, and uh, apply paper to using the glue, and only these two fingers get messy, and I don't get glue everywhere. I've tried to have it in like a pot, and um, and the brushes and like trying to use that as a way of like using my mixture, and the bristles in the brush get hard, and then you just waste money on brushes, and then if a cat knocks it over, then it gets everywhere. So this is a really great kind of uh, uh, application device that I use so that I don't make a huge mess. And it's already designed for glue, so that makes it even better. Because I've used some other things that were not designed for glue before, and like the nozzles would always get clogged up, and then I would spend time like trying to take a needle and scrape things out and pull things out and mess around with that, where this is kind of designed for glue. So I kept this once this was kind of empty, and you can kind of see the residue of where there was wood glue in there. And then also I can shake it up. In theory, you're not supposed to shake stuff up like this. You're supposed to mix it very thoroughly, but it can create air bubbles. But when this, you can just shake it up and it gets really well kind of distributed and mixed thoroughly. And you don't have it where there's stuff along the edges, kind of like when you're making a cake and you have to scrape down the edges of your bowls every once in a while you're using the mixer. And that's because it won't be mixed all the way, and then you'll have a streak uh, of like the PVA glue, and then there'll be this weird like shiny streak, and it's weird. So, anyways, I mix it and I put it into this, and I can shake it up and I can use it, and it's an easy applicator, and I like it. So, what I do is I open my okay, I open my nozzle up, and I kind of plan out the colors that I'm going to use. So I'm working with some warmer colors. So I try to get at least 3 different colors, sometimes more depending on what I'm doing. But I don't tend to go less than that because it can kind of look weird to me. So I try to have like a color story. And that's one of the things like I like to do with this is I feel like everybody's sense of color is an evolution. It's always evolving, it's always changing and growing and becoming more nuanced and shifting and growing. And so these things also are helpful for me because then I can start seeing how those what I'm being drawn towards. So before I guess I was into really like washy kind of greens and uh ketchup and mustard flavor. And so I'll kind of tear these into small pieces. And I like to have a good mix. So some small pieces, some larger pieces. And I kind of hold these off to the side. And it's kind of like, it's very meditative. And I'm just kind of creating a jigsaw almost of this. All right. And then I can put this. I was just bragging about this container. All right, there it goes. And then I just take my fingertip and I smear it around. And you can tell it's got a slightly different consistency than regular glue. It's a little bit thinner than regular glue. And you have to get the ratio just right because if you have too much moisture, it can cause your pieces to really buckle. And what I do is I take that finger and I push it down into the glue, but I also run a little bit of that glue over the top of it. And what that is basically is doing is creating an envelope for your collaged element. And that kind of holds it in place, but it also protects it. So if I'm going to be doing anything where it just makes it a little bit more it's protected a little bit more. All right. And also you're flattening it out. And what I'm also doing is I work from the center of my piece outward and I push if there is any air bubbles in it, it pushes the air bubbles out because you can see like there's an air bubble in there. Also, if there's an excess of glue inside, it squeezes the excess of glue out. If it gets glues trapped in the inside of the paper, it can cause problems later on. Because what can happen is when I go to iron this, if there's wet moisture underneath a dry surface, it will just peel the paper up, and that's not always good. Or it can end up bleeding out and sticking to the other papers, and then it gets stuck together, which is not the end of the world. I'm not really meticulous about stuff like that, but some people are, and that can be very frustrating. One of the other things that you may have noticed is that I tear all of these pieces of paper. For the pieces of artwork, I cut those, but for the collaged elements, I always tear those. And one of the reasons why is the edges. I feel like when you have a torn edge, it can blend into things a little bit differently than than if it's cut. If it's cut, it creates kind of almost like a seam. But when you have torn edges, they blend together and it doesn't have that same kind of like hard edge to them. So when I'm creating these collages, I like to have torn edges. All right. So I like to do this in a very kind of intuitive fashion. So I kind of get my colors ready and then I start working it down. I turn my canvases around or my work surfaces around. Um, and so that I don't get stuck where I'm only looking at from one direction. A lot of times in my pieces, I end up flipping them several times, and the painting may start out where this is the top and this is the bottom and this is the left and this is the right. But then I'll decide later on that I want it to be oriented horizontally in a landscape view, and then it completely changes everything. And I feel like um, those changes, if you don't plan for them, then you have to change it later. So you do have to work somewhat quickly because this glue does dry on the quicker side, this glue mixture. And yeah. So in this, you can kind of see the backgrounds um, a little bit. It's just like a little peekaboo. There's a little bit of evidence that it's there, but it's not like you wouldn't know. And I kind of like it when there's bits of text and you're like, what does that say? It says something, but you'll never know because it's kind of glued under. And one of the things I also like to do is I like to see um, I worked with this wonderful artist named Elena Sisto, and she talked about like the modernist space and the ideas of pushing and pulling. So certain colors, darker colors recede, brighter colors pop forward, larger objects pop forward, smaller objects recede. It's like a visual kind of hack. Once you know like that, like where like the placement of things, it can change your idea of like what you want to do. Like if I want this kind of central element to pop up, I use a brighter color. If I want this to be more subdued, I can push it back. And then there was David Hockney. He talks about the push pull. So you want things sometimes to push back, and there's like a tension. And like the most beautiful objects are the ones that have that kind of tension of push and pull. And for me, I try to look at this and I want the eye to travel all the way around. So sometimes if I want it to be all kind of one layer, what I'll do is I'll take a small piece of say a brighter color and play around with it. It's kind of like working in a very abstract way. This is very abstract and not very representational, but it all still applies where you're trying to work on the composition of a piece. And, those, even if it's not representational, sometimes those elements still matter. And a lot of times this abstract kind of color field and color blocking, you're not going to actually see this later on, but I think it's there. It's nice that it's there. And yeah, so anyway, so once this is completely dry, then when this is completely dry, I sandwich this in between two pieces of thick brown paper, like for like a brown paper bag. And the reason why I like those is because it doesn't really stick. Sometimes if you use paper that there is not all paper is created equally, I should say that. And sometimes that paper can kind of stick, and when you're heating up glue, it becomes softer. And so when it's soft, and it's sticky, it can really bond to itself, and you don't want it because then you have to pry your pieces apart. So I use that and I iron the backs of this to kind of reinforce that memory that it's flat. And I will probably iron these um, probably 5 or 6 times before all is said and done. Maybe not, maybe four or 5 times I'll iron these. I've already ironed these twice. So sometimes I'll recruit William to help me if I'm trying to get some stuff done. But yeah, so these have already been ironed twice, and they'll probably be ironed another 2 to 3 more times as I add layers. All right, so that kind of shows you where I'm at currently in this project. I've made I've made 100 of these, and I probably will make a few more than 100 just in case I mess something up. Then I'm not super precious about it. And I think what I'm gonna do is instead I might get the gel press out and do some patterns on top and do some fun kind of building up of layers of paint that way because it's super fast. Well, it's relatively fast. And then I can start building up other different techniques. I am a smitten kitten with this technique of taking salt and using that, but it's a process that's very kind of time consuming and you have to let it dry naturally so that it soaks up the color and it creates this kind of mottled, like, uh, it looks almost like it's stippled in some ways. But what happens is the salt, it soaks up the water and the moisture, and it also soaks up the pigment. So it looks like little shatter stars all over. And I love that technique, but I don't think I'm going to have time to do that. And I also would have to change up the surface of this. This is less shiny than it would be if I just used the PVA glue, but it's still pretty shiny and water resistant. So if I wanted it to be able to accept that and do it where it was actually like working, I would have to either mix something into the paint to create an absorbent ground, or I would have to paint it with an absorbent ground or like a clear gesso, just so that there was a tooth and that so that it just wouldn't like sit on the surface. It would then kind of have that natural kind of watercolor effect. All right. So I think we've talked for about an hour and I'm going to get back to work. So I'm going to check in. What time is it now? All right. So it's 4 o'clock now. So I'm going to check back in at 6 o'clock and show you the progress that I've made on these pieces. What do you think? And then probably every 2 hours or so, I'll do a check-in. And it also depends on how much work I get done in between. I've already started building up some of the layers on some of the other pieces, but it'll take time. And I'm not afraid of that. Before, when it was only constricted to 24 hours, I was much more frantic. And the first time I did this, where I kind of documented the process, I was checking in on the hour, and I was talking for at least 30 minutes. And so really I was only having 12 hours to do all the paintings. And I was exhausted. I was thunderstruck because I just didn't have enough time. I had half the amount of time that I normally did, and that the time that I had before was not a lot of time, especially when you consider everything has to dry. So anyways, So I kind of derailed myself doing that by checking in too often and talking too long. So I'm going to check in again around 6 o'clock Eastern time, and I'll see you then. Okay, bye-bye.